Sean, do you want to say a few things to start, or would you like me to just jump in?
Sure, I'd be happy to jump in. So thanks, Jamie. Firstly, just want to thank everybody for attending tonight. My name's Sean Luz. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Framingham. I work alongside a number of amazing people, especially those that are working on the Hazard Mitigation Plan Working Group. And I'll let Jamie just jump into it about, what this meeting is about and really get into the specifics. But yeah, really appreciate you being here to share, to learn about this process and also share your feedback about, critical natural hazards for the city. And before we start, I'd be remiss to not also mention the support team that we have tonight with us, including Renan Pinheiro and Kezia Franca. So I'll turn it over to Renan just to cover some additional language support we'll have tonight.
Olá, boa noite a todos. Se houver alguém aqui na sala que precisa de ajuda em português, por favor, levante a mão ou escreva alguma coisa no chat que nós vamos estar ajudando você. Muito obrigado. E agora eu vou passar a palavra para a Kezia, que é a nossa intérprete de espanhol aqui hoje.
Hola, buenas noches. Mi nombre es Kesia. Si necesita de traducción para español, por favor, me deja saber en el chat. Gracias.
Okay, thank you very much. My name's Jamie Caplan, and before we get into the details, if you can on your phone or computer, iPad, whatever you're working on, go to this website, menti.com, and put in this code. You will be able to see the presentation, and I'm going to ask you some questions. You'll be able to type in your answers. So when you get that, you can just give a thumbs up and we'll know that we've got some people there. If it's too technical for you and you can't do it, that's okay. I don't want you to worry about it. I just want to give it to you as an option. Seems like some people are finding their way. All right, and I'll show you this slide again in a couple minutes. So my name's Jamie Caplan, and I'm in Northampton, Massachusetts. I have a consulting firm. We work nationwide. At the moment, we're under contract with the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency to develop hazard mitigation plans for 14 municipalities throughout the state, Framingham being one of them. I am supported by a consulting team that includes Darren Punchard, who's our deputy project manager, Bill Bond, who's our risk assessment lead, and David Murphy, who's our mitigation specialist. And together, the four of us work quite a bit on a number of different projects, not just in Massachusetts, but really throughout the country. And we've been working on hazard mitigation plans and working in emergency management, all of us for over 20 years, I think. We're an aging group, but anyway, we've got a tremendous amount of expertise, and we're happy to be working with you. So we're a small enough group that if you have questions, just go ahead and raise your hand or unmute yourself. But hopefully the presentation will walk you through a bit about what our project's about and how we are developing your plan, and get your input, and hopefully answer any questions that you have. So for those of you who aren't familiar, hazard mitigation is considered any sustained action to reduce or eliminate risk to people and property from natural hazards and their effects. And that fancy definition is just a way of saying that we don't have to have disasters, right? We are going to have hazards like winter storms or high winds, but we don't have to let those things turn into disasters. And the actions that we take to prevent the disasters are considered mitigation measures. And when we spend money to mitigate disasters, we're in fact saving on average $1 for every $6 we could have spent. So if you wait for the disaster, it is much more expensive financially, but also in terms of lives. So we want to mitigate risk, and we've certainly seen FEMA and Congress prioritize hazard mitigation. So the benefits of a mitigation planning process, which is what we're undergoing to develop your plan update, is that we will identify cost-effective actions for the city to reduce risk. You know, we're looking for reasonable activities you can implement. We will focus resources on your greatest vulnerabilities. So we identify what those vulnerabilities are and help you identify where you can put your resources. I think the process of developing a hazard mitigation plan is a way to build partnerships. I think the opportunity for all of you to gather on the phone or on the Zoom today is really worthwhile. It's a great starting place and probably something that you wouldn't do otherwise. The plan and planning process increases awareness of hazards and risks. I suspect that at least one thing I say today will be informative to each of you, and that's good. We're learning something. The plan will communicate the city's priorities. That's our priority as a consulting team, to make sure that we really do communicate what your priorities are and the direction that you're going. And in that vein, we align with your other objectives. I know it says town, but your city's objectives. So where you're going, what you're interested in, that needs to be reflected in the hazard mitigation plan. And finally, like I mentioned before, if you implement this plan, it will in fact save lives and money. And that's the biggest benefit to it, I think. So just as a little background for you, emergency management has 4 phases. This is a very simplified way of looking at it. Preparedness is things like having first aid kits and flashlights and things that you do when you know the storm is coming. So we all live in New England. People head out to buy milk and bread when there's a big winter storm. That's preparedness. Response is exactly what it sounds like. You know, that's first responders heading out to handle whatever emergency has happened. Recovery, same thing, very self-explanatory. It's putting all the pieces back together, if you will. But mitigation is what you're going to do before there's any disaster. So I'm assuming Framingham has similar weather to Northampton at the moment. It's a nice summer evening, right? It's a little hot, but it's not unbearably hot. So on a day like today, what do you do to make sure that if you had extreme temperatures or a big storm, you don't end up having a disaster? That's what mitigation is, and that's what the plan is all about. So when you have a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan, which is what we're developing for you, you are then eligible for FEMA pre-disaster funding. And you use that funding for things like this list that I've bulleted in bold. You can buy out flood prone properties, you could do flood proofing, you could elevate structures, you could retrofit things like culverts or bridges, stabilize slopes, improve drainage. I know a lot of those were flood related, but that's the kind of activity. And the funding sources typically come from either this BRIC program, which is just 2 years old, to FEMA, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, the flood mitigation assistance program that they have, or the hazard mitigation grant program. That one's only available after a presidential disaster declaration. But again, to be eligible for these funds, you need to have this plan developed, approved by FEMA, and then adopted by the city. So one of the first things we do in developing your plan, since it's a plan update, is look to the previous plan, which Framingham has from 2017. You were considered a town then, according to the plan. But anyway, we look back to that plan, we look to all of the information in it and see what's changed and how can we update it. We look to the state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan. That's a FEMA requirement that the local plans be consistent with the state level plan. And Darren Punchard and I, who are updating this plan, were had a lead role, each of us, in developing the state's plan in 2018. So we're very familiar with that, which I think brings some advantage to developing your plan. And then we also look to your municipal vulnerability preparedness program, which is something that I suspect some of you participated in. And that's from 2019. So we start with some research into, what exists already. We also look to some other plans that you have. And we've spoken with some of you, as well as done some online research to get a sense of what's there. And that's how we come up with your plan. Well, it's a piece of how we get to your plan, I should say. So let me remind you again to go to this website if you can, menti.com, and put in this code 3199-4504, and you should see this slide. And then I'm going to ask you some questions, and you're going to be able to type in the responses. And the way I've designed the presentation and the questions is to kind of guide you through the process that we go through a little bit to developing your plan. So you'll have a sense of how we come up with it. Does anybody have a question so far? I don't see any hands raised. Okay. We'll push on and you let me know. So the first question involves who lives and works in the city of Framingham. This can be anybody, but we're looking for sort of categories of people. And now when I show you this slide, you should be able to type in your responses and we'll see them come up. And if you type them in Spanish or Portuguese, we can have our translators help us with what that says, or help me, I should say. Great. So you work in Framingham. Young professionals with growing families. Good. Some people only work in Framingham. 70,000 people live in Framingham. Okay. Are all the people healthy, middle-aged people? No, right? Who else? All right, a large youth population, a diverse community, right? Not everybody speaks English. That's very important to know. First-time homeowners. Think anybody in Framingham has handicaps or disabilities? The elderly, good, thank you. People with disabilities. 2 adult homeowners, retirees. Good. All right. So that's something that we do developing a plan is we want to get a good sense of who's in the community that we're looking at. And one of the ways that we do that is put together this hazard mitigation planning committee. I think you guys like to call it a working group. And that group represents professionals who are part of the city government for the most part. And their role is to provide us with some data and information as a consulting team, assist in identifying and prioritizing mitigation actions. They'll review and comment on draft documents and finally approve the draft plan before we submit it to FEMA. I mean to MEMA and then to FEMA. So now we have a sense of who's in Framingham. Now I want to ask you, what buildings, organizations, infrastructure do those people rely on? What do they need to get through the day? And the next slide gives you a chance to write in your responses. And there's definitely no wrong answers in any of this. Schools, that's good. I'm a mom, we wouldn't make it without the schools. Senior center, daycares, public transportation, placed by food, municipal buildings, city offices, the library, supermarkets, beaches, okay, library. food pantries, FEMA, shelters, good. Commuter rail, public safety buildings, streets, good. Streets and roads. I was hoping someone would say that. Medical care. Lodging. These are good answers. So that's gas stations is key. Public transportation, good. So, oh yeah, the Mass Pike, that's a good one. So that's what we do. And here's a sample list of what we call critical facilities. So when we're working on a hazard mitigation plan, first we're looking at who's in the community, and then we want to know what do they rely on. So just like you mentioned, we've identified libraries, we've identified FEMA, medical centers. I don't know that any of you mentioned fire department or public works, but that's key, right? All your first responders, fire, police, senior center, the housing authority. And then we also want to really look towards infrastructure, right? Your water and sewer infrastructure, pumping stations. So that's some of what we do. Then we begin to think about what weather-related hazards can impact these people or these buildings and infrastructure that we've already identified. You can answer that question here. So we're really looking for a laundry list of what I would call hazards. Down trees, good, and that's going to happen because of high winds, flooding, snowstorms, yep. Fires, good. Heat, rain, COVID, snow, hurricane, drought, lightning, northeasters, 4 seasons of extreme weather. Say that's New England. What else? Storms, drought, good. Ice, heat and humidity. This is a good list. All right, so let me show you the list that we've developed. So this is the list that we have, and we've organized our list of hazards in terms of primary climate change interaction. And we do that because that's how the hazards are listed and identified in the state hazard mitigation plan. And I'm sure you remember that in the beginning, I mentioned that it's a FEMA requirement that we be consistent with the state level plan. The state does need to review your plan. So this is a way to sort of speak their language, if you will. Plus, personally, I think it really makes sense. So, and then our priority is your natural hazards. We're not looking for, and FEMA does not require things like mass shooting or any kind of man-made hazard. Even hazardous materials is not something that we cover in any depth. So just natural hazards. And the 2 in green, we've added to your list from your previous plan. So we've reorganized your list of hazards, and then we've added invasive species and of course, infectious disease. So then what we do is put it all together to come up with what we would call your risk. So we're looking at this list of natural hazards, and we consider them in terms of their history, location, the extent, which is sort of the amount that it can occur, and your future probability. So for instance, in terms of extent, we can have high heat. We all know, 3 days of over 90 degrees is a heat wave. You're not going to have a whole lot of days of 120, right? Your extent is probably like 95, maybe it could get to 100, but it's not going to go beyond that. So that's how we describe that. And then when you're looking at location, when you consider things like flooding, that's going to occur along streams and rivers, as well as whatever flooding you would have if your culverts are backing up or storm drains are backing up, but it's only in certain areas where something like high winds or winter storms, it's an atmospheric hazard that's going to happen throughout the city. Then we look at your critical facilities, which is that list that you helped create and that we looked at. And when we put them together, we're saying what can happen to these critical facilities. That's where we come up with your risk, which is What is the potential for damage, loss, or other impacts created by this interaction of natural hazards and critical facilities? And we generate a number of maps because pictures speak louder than words sometimes. And I know it's hard for you to see this map, but we do have a number of maps and we look at each hazard. And if we can, we're mapping where those critical facilities are and then where the hazards may impact the community. And these slides we can make available to you. You don't need to copy them now if you want to. All right, here's an example of some of the mapping we did for the environmental justice communities. This is something that we've emphasized as a consulting team and that MEMA is certainly supporting and interested in. And the reason that we're doing this is that unfortunately, we've noticed that environmental justice communities tend to be exponentially more impacted, if you will, by natural hazards, right? They're suffering more. And when we turn around to identify ways to mitigate risk, we want to make sure that we're focusing on these communities. All right, here's another example map of wildfire probability. And these are explained in some detail in the plan, or a lot of detail. All right, so then we have to put it all together and basically say, what are we going to do about it? So what can be done to lessen the impact of these hazards to protect people and property in the city of Framingham? What are you going to do so that you don't have disasters? And you can come up with a list right here. And there are no bad ideas. Bioswales, good. Maintaining structures like streets and drains, trim trees to prevent limbs crashing on people and properties, good one. Emergency drills, good. Facility hardening is very good. Maintaining open space so water can be absorbed. I love that one. Putting utilities underground is good. Wildfire preparation, educating people is very good. Energy resilience. You guys don't need me. Do not allow development in floodplains. Thumbs up for that one. Geothermal to heat homes and buildings. Good. Anybody else?
And Jamie, I just wanted to jump in real quick and say the links to the slides are in the chat. So just in case you want to look at something a little bit closer, you can see them there. I'll post them at the end again.
Okay. Thank you. Strengthening the community, solar panel rebates. Yep, any kind of incentive plans are always good. Maintaining the walls on the rail trail to secure the ground above. Good. All right, so that's exactly the kind of work that we do. And when we look at mitigation, what we call mitigation actions, we're trying to come up with the same kind of list. We look to 4 different categories: local plans and regulations. These are things like your hazard mitigation plan or land use ordinances, which may say you can't build in a floodplain or you have to build above to a certain level, or building codes and enforcing building codes. So you build in a safe way, preserving open space. So local plans and regulations tend to be not super expensive compared to things like this next category of structure and infrastructure projects, but they may require some political push or goodwill, I suppose. Then your structure and infrastructure projects. These are your big budget projects. For instance, putting utilities underground, fixing culverts, flood walls, think bulldozers and hard hats. Then natural systems protection is something that fortunately people are focusing more and more on. And somebody mentioned this previously about, kind of letting water go where it needs to go. So sediment and erosion control, stream corridor restoration, forest management, wetland restoration. These things will prevent disasters in areas where we've put buildings and people. And then education and awareness programs, which are my personal favorite. I always think they're your biggest bang for your buck. And if you have a well-educated and informed community, it will be more resilient. So there's many ways to do this. Obviously, you could have meetings like this one, put information online, on the radio, real estate disclosures, presentations to school groups, mailings, etc. So just so you know, our project has a timeline that puts us finishing your plan by the end of this fiscal year, or the end of this calendar year, I should say. We will meet with your hazard mitigation planning committee or working group 4 times. And we've got the 3rd meeting scheduled for later this week, I believe. And obviously we'll have another public meeting again, probably just before Thanksgiving. That's our schedule. And then this is the list of tasks. And basically it's that same kind of process that I just walked you through is what we're going through. And just finally, so you know, as the plan finishes up, the public or you all will have an opportunity to review the draft plan and comment on that plan, and your comments are included in the plan. So it's worth taking the time to look at it. And the next public meeting that we have will focus more on the mitigation actions that we've developed for the city. And that's my contact information. But if you would like to unmute yourselves and ask any questions or have any kind of discussion, I'm happy to do that. We do have some time left, or if you've got questions, you want to put them in the chat, that's fine. We could also reach out to Sean. I don't know if Sean, you want to put your contact information in the chat, might be helpful. Anybody have any questions? Hopefully I didn't confuse you.
So just to add, I put there's an email set up specifically for any questions, comments, concerns related to the hazard mitigation planning process. So it's just hazardmitigation@framingham.ma.gov. But of course, also I can put my contact information too over there, just in case you want to reach out. Always happy to take your call.
All right, we're going to wrap up unless anybody has a question. Oh, go ahead, Chloe. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi. So the previous plan that we had in place for the city, what was missing? Like, what was wrong with it to begin with that made us have to revise it?
That's a great question, and I should have covered that. There's nothing wrong with it. FEMA requires that the plan get redone every 5 years. So it's just a federal requirement that the plan be reviewed and updated every 5 years. It makes sense because your priorities may shift and the list of mitigation actions would certainly shift. So one thing that's included in the plan every time it's updated is a report on which mitigation actions were implemented and which weren't, and are those still relevant or not. So it's just a way to keep the information current. The other thing that's in the plan is a chapter about how to implement the plan, and one thing that's included in there is that the planning team, that hazard mitigation planning committee or your working group would meet a couple times a year on a regular basis. And then following any large scale disaster, you would also meet to review the plan and get a sense of if you need to make any changes to it. So it remains a living document through the 5 years. You don't have to share any updates within that 5-year time span with FEMA, but then just before it expires, you need to submit it again for review.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Anybody else with a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Jamie. How are you? I'm sorry I'm coming in at the end of your presentation.
Oh, no problem.
I was just coming back from a funeral. That soldier that died, Natick, was a friend of mine. So sorry to be late.
Oh, I'm
But,
sorry for your loss.
I just, this is obviously from a planning tool. This is much needed, especially when we're going to be applying for grants in the future. And to be able to just look at a plan. As you guys know, we received a $500,000 EPA assessment grant that has to be spent by, I think, 2026. But of course, it's all tied together. It's not just, it's stormwater, it's environmental. And having a plan to be able to go to and to use is just going to do nothing but help the city going forward. So, and obviously, as we track new development, right, to be able to refer and to look at a plan for other impacts. We know that, there are drainage issues that we're learning right now, looking at 380 Waverly Street, that project. Was reported that there's some downstream flooding at the Pelham Apartments. So that's something that, we'll need to address. But no, this is obviously a very important piece, and I'm glad that it's getting done. Thank you. Thank you, and Sean as well.
You're welcome. So we have a question in the chat about, could you talk about the schedule in terms of approval and a little more about grant monies? And could you tell me the downside of not having a plan approved by NEMA? Yes. So, okay, one thing at a time. The schedule in terms of approval, I cannot tell you because it's really up to MEMA, the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, and then FEMA. MEMA, we're under contract with MEMA, so they've been very actively involved in the development of this plan. They know that when to expect it, and will be prepared to review it. So I don't think that will take very long. In my experience working on these hazard mitigation plans, which is something that I've been doing for over 20 years, I've had very little changes required. We're not, as a consulting team, sent back to the drawing board. Occasionally there's a sentence or a word or something that's missing, but nothing big. So that process would probably turn around within a month. Then FEMA has 90 days to review a hazard mitigation plan, and they have the right to ask questions or make comments that would then go back. So 3 or 4 months. It can happen really quickly. If FEMA is very busy with a disaster, it will take longer. But I can't promise anything. And then let me jump to the third question there about the downside. The downside is that if you don't have a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan, you are not eligible for that pre-disaster funding. And I know I didn't go into those grant sources in great detail, but let me show them to you again. Sorry, this is flipping quickly. Okay, so FEMA will respond to the city if you have a disaster, whether you have a hazard mitigation plan or not. If you do have a large scale disaster and you are awarded federal funding, you then also are in a place where you could get additional funding to mitigate risk, and you wouldn't be eligible for some of that funding without this plan. The other thing, so that's post-disaster funding. Then in terms of pre-disaster funding, like you're talking about the drainage issue, and what if you need to do a study to figure out how to avoid flooding, that downstream flooding at the Pelham Apartments? you need grant funding, I'm assuming, pre-disaster to identify that, and then you would seek funding for the remedy of that. You would want to look to that Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC for short, as a funding source, and you wouldn't be eligible for that money without this plan. Does that explain it? I'm trying to keep it really basic. Did you have another question or follow-up?
Yeah, Jamie, as far as federal funding for this, I've been told that next year that we can directly apply to the federal feds for different transportation projects.
Okay.
And, there's going to be, as you heard, boatloads of funding for transportation projects. And, the city has been negotiating the Denison project, right? The Denison Park project for years now. And I know the mayor wants to, get final resolution and get that project going. That's a massive project. That's a $20 million project. That's today's dollars. Every year that goes by, the costs go up $1 million or $2 million a year, but
Right.
that has a huge drainage component to it,
Mhm.
flood storage component to that project. What do you see as far as like our ability to try to tap into those federal funds?
I think you definitely have the ability to do it. And FEMA, I should qualify that by saying I am not an expert in getting grant funding and there's so many sources of where to get grant funding. BRIC has been out for only a couple of years. I have been successful at developing some projects for some communities and they've received BRIC funding. But again, that's not my expertise. So, I can answer your question to the best of my ability, but I'm not the best person probably to answer it. But I will tell you that FEMA, at least, the money flows from FEMA to MEMA, and they do prioritize getting funding from multiple sources for a project, or as well as collaborating with other governments. So, if your project crosses city boundaries to a town or something, and you collaborate with them, that's going to make your project look more attractive. If you have support from other organizations, whether it is state or a nonprofit or, any other government organization in the city, that makes the project look more attractive for your grant funding. So to me, it sounds like it's very possible. We can certainly make sure in the plan that we're emphasizing where the hazards are and what projects you want to do. That's part of what we ask this Hazard Mitigation Planning Committee to help us with, is make sure that their objectives are seen in the plan. Because really it's kind of like a legal brief, but it's making the case for what you want to do.
Right.
And what's needed. So as much as I can support you on that, that's where I focus my energy, is like helping you identify, okay, this is the project you want to do.
Yeah.
And here's why.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Other questions or comments? The next public meeting that we do will give you a better look into each chapter in the plan and what you can expect when you review the plan. All right, anybody else? Okay, thank you. All right, well, it was my pleasure getting to know you all a little bit. If you come up with other questions, just go ahead and reach out to Sean and to that email, hazardmitigation@framingham.ma.gov, and we'll get back to you, and we'll make sure to get the word out to you when we have the next public meeting.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamie. And just to add too, in addition to that email address, I will also post, if you give me a second, the hazard mitigation website, where we're going to be hosting all this material, including this presentation. So it's a great place if you lose track or you're just kind of touching base again. You can visit there, and you'll find all the latest info. But yeah, thanks again, everyone, for joining tonight. And if you have any questions, feel free to follow up.
All right, and shout out, thank you to Renan and Kezia for participating. I've never done a bilingual presentation, and I'm glad that you were here to help, so thank you. All right, take care, everyone.